Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2014 Robert S. Gordon Jr. Lecture in Epidemiology. My name is David Murray. I'm the Associate Director for Prevention and the Director of the Office of Disease Prevention, and I'm very pleased to represent Dr. Collins this afternoon and introduce our speaker. The Robert S. Gordon Jr. Lecture is awarded each year to a scientist who has made major contributions to research or training in the field of epidemiology or in the conduct of clinical trials. The Gordon Lecture Award recipient is selected based on the recommendation of the NIH Epidemiology and Clinical Trials Interest Group. This is the 20th year that the Office of Disease Prevention has sponsored the Gordon Lecture Award. If you look at the back of your program, you will see a list of very prominent scientists who have received this award in previous years. The Gordon Lecture Award was established in tribute to Robert S. Gordon for his dedication to the field of epidemiology and for his distinguished service to NIH. Over the course of 30 years, Dr. Gordon served in numerous senior leadership positions, including Special Assistant to the Director and Chief Advisor for Clinical Practice and Research. Dr. Gordon was an early organizer of efforts to address the emerging problem of HIV and AIDS, and he became a key coordinator for AIDS research. For the last 10 years of his service to NIH, Dr. Gordon made important contributions to policy and management issues regarding epidemiology, clinical trials, and the health effects of environmental hazards. It's a pleasure for me to introduce this year's Gordon Lecture Award recipient, Dr. Moises Sklo. Dr. Sklo received his medical degree from the University of Rio de Janeiro in 1963. He obtained his master's and Doctor of Public Health degrees from the Johns Hopkins University in 1972 and 1974. He joined the faculty as assistant professor in epidemiology at Johns Hopkins in 1974 and has served as professor in the Department of Epidemiology in the Bloomberg School of Public Health since 1980. He has joint appointments as well in cardiology and oncology at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Sklo has been a principal investigator on two of the largest cohort studies of the natural history of atherosclerosis. The ERIC study, which we know as atherosclerosis risk in communities, and the MESA study, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. Both studies continue to make major contributions to our understanding of the risk factors of cardiovascular disease. Dr. Sklo has written more than 200 peer-reviewed papers. I was looking at PubMed last night and noticed that he is the only Sklo who comes up when you search under authors. He also is the author of a very well-known textbook, Epidemiology Beyond the Basics, and that book is now in its third edition, and I'm pleased to say that I have all three editions in my office. Dr. Sklo's dedication to training is evident as he has received many awards for teaching and educational activities, including the Stebbins Medal, the Abraham Lilienfeld Award, and 2 Golden Apples, which were bestowed upon him by the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Students' Assembly for excellence in teaching. He has mentored dozens of master's and doctoral students, including many investigators here at NIH. Dr. Sklo's presentation today is titled Epidemiology Back to Translation. There will be time for questions after the presentation, and I would also invite everyone who is here this afternoon to join me at a reception for Dr. Sklo in the NIH library, which is just across the hall to my left. Now, please join me in welcoming this year's Robert S. Gordon Jr. Lecture Award recipient, Dr. Moises Sklo.
Got my water ready here. This is a real honor. You know, I'm very honored to be this year's Robert S. Gordon Lecturer. And I'd like to thank the committee for choosing me and Dr. Murray. I also want to thank Denise Stradrick, who has been an impeccable hostess. And I've always been in awe of Dr. Gordon's accomplishments, so it's a special honor. Now, talking about translational epidemiology is, of course, not new. Epidemiology, as you know, was born out of the need to provide research findings and evaluation tools for the public health practitioner. And from its early days, it was consistent with Goethe's contention in that knowledge should be applied in the planning and implementation of public health action. Now, you know, an important landmark was Snow's studies on cholera in the mid-1800s in London, and the application of the results of these studies to control cholera. What is extraordinary about Snow is that on the basis of his epidemiological observations, and many years before the microbiology era, he concluded that the agent responsible for cholera was a live organism that could multiply. Now, on the other hand, and parenthetically, you all know about the Broad Street pump. And he removed the pump, and theoretically, he would have stopped the cholera epidemic. But what some of you may not know is that when the handle was removed, the epidemic was already on the wane, prompting the definition of an epidemiologist as someone who coasts to glory in the descending portion of the epidemic curve. Now, obviously, this definition doesn't apply to Frost, whose key contributions basically changed the paradigm of cholera transmission. Now, it is interesting that until about 30 to 40 years ago, most epidemiologists in the academia had significant public health background and considered as their responsibility to apply results of epidemiological research to the solution of practical public health problems. Now, take, for example, Morton Levin. Levin was one of the first investigators to report on the association between smoking and lung cancer, and spent the last years of his professional life as a professor at Johns Hopkins. So his contributions to academic epidemiology were considerable. Yet he was sincerely surprised at being chosen as the recipient of the Frost Award from the American Public Health Association for excellence in epidemiology, as he saw himself primarily as a public health worker, not as an epidemiologist. And this self-image also explains why he believed that his most important contribution to public health had been to facilitate the poliomyelitis vaccine trials in New York City, as a health officer, and to make sure that a random allocation schedule was used. He was the first to develop the concept and formula for the unadjusted population attributable risk, which he did to help him in the planning of prevention strategies, which the relative risk alone could not do. Now let's turn to specifically to translational research. There are several definitions of translational research. For example, the Clinical and Translational Science Institute's definition for the National Cancer Institute is that translational research is a type of research that transforms scientific findings from laboratory, clinical, or population studies into clinical applications to reduce incidence, morbidity, and mortality. Now, the Institute of Medicine defines two translational blocks. Block one is the transfer of new understandings of disease mechanisms gained in the laboratory into the development of new methods for diagnosis, therapy, and prevention, and their first testing in humans. And block two is translation of results from clinical studies into everyday clinical practice and health decision-making. Now, a more specific epidemiological definition, which considers the full scope of epidemiology, might be along the following lines: is effective transfer of new knowledge resulting from epidemiological studies, including trials, into the planning of population-wide and individual-level control programs and policies. Now, translation epidemiology and translational science in general are closely related, but also somewhat distinct from implementation science, which has been defined by the Institute of Medicine as seeking to understand the behavior of healthcare professionals and other stakeholders as a key variable in the sustainable uptake, adoption, and implementation of evidence-based interventions. Thus, implementation science seems to be primarily focused on the logistics of implementation, to the extent that it seeks to promote integration of evidence-based intervention into healthcare practice. Now, in terms of health policy, I think it's very interesting to consider Tugwell's proposal of an iterative loop, summarizing all stages in disease control, which include assessing the burden of illness, studying the etiology of the disease and the risk factor burden, determining efficacy and then community effectiveness, evaluating cost effectiveness, implementing and monitoring a program or policy, and finally reassessing the burden of illness and or risk factors. So epidemiology is represented in virtually all these phases, with the possible exception of evaluation of cost effectiveness and the actual implementation of the program. While community effectiveness is the main, in my opinion, the main focus of translation epidemiology, cost effectiveness is the main target of health technology assessment units. And as you all know, epidemiology has made major contributions to public health over the years, including the smoking prevention strategies, radiation and air pollution exposure standards, and others. So let me now turn to the translational process itself. Now, this is the classical definition of epidemiology, the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified population, and the application of this study to control health problems. Thus, this definition has two components. The challenge is really to translate from the first to the second component, which is really not a straightforward process. Now, you all know about this cartoon, it's very well known. So there is a step in the process that is not totally scientific. The natural history of the translational process starts with the acquisition of evidence, of course, from epidemiological studies. I'm talking about specifically translational epidemiology. The next step should be, ideally, systematic reviews, although sometimes policymakers have to rely on results of a single study, particularly if this study is a randomized trial of good quality. The next step is evaluation of levels of evidence and selection of programmatic or policy options resulting from decision analysis. I would propose that this phase is clearly in the realm of translational epidemiology. Additional steps require expertise outside epidemiology and include estimation of cost effectiveness with sensitivity analysis, recommendations, and finally, evidence-based policies, in which there is often a tension between evidence and obstacles, such as those related to resources, ethical problems, politics, etc. Now, let me give you a further idea of the interface between epidemiology and both translation and implementation. What I'm going to do now is to use the concepts described by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force and Canada's periodic health examination. But I can see other types of models to describe the interaction between knowledge, translation, and implementation. Now, as I have already mentioned, the translational process starts with an evaluation of the levels of evidence. And they address the issue of whether the intervention program or policy does more good than harm. So level Roman 1 is defined by at least one well-designed randomized clinical trial. Roman 2 refers to well-designed observational studies. Level 2.2 is based on dramatic results in uncontrolled experiments suggesting that the intervention does more good than harm. So these are the so-called natural experiments. That's the jargon that epidemiologists use. For example, those that have shown a sharp decline in the incidence of tuberculosis meningitis after the introduction of streptomycin, or a decline in diabetes mortality following the introduction of insulin. A recent example is the sharp decrease in caloric intake during the crisis resulting from the economic blockade in Cuba, lasting from 1989 through 2000, with a shift to the left of the body mass index distribution and a corresponding decrease in the prevalence of obesity. Now, in this slide, the more darkly shaded areas coincide with the peak of the economic crisis, which occurred from 1991 through 1995. note the striking decline in mortality from coronary heart disease in Cuba that occurred at the beginning of the worst phase of the blockade. So this data suggests that caloric restriction is a key factor in the prevention of obesity and its consequences, and that population-wide measures, unfortunately in this case under unhappy circumstances, of course, are likely to be effective. Additionally, if valid, this data surprisingly suggests that the effect of obesity on coronary heart disease mortality seems to be characterized by a short incubation period of approximately 1 to 2 years, which implies that mediators of these relationships, such as inflammatory markers, may have a precipitating effect. There was also a sharp decline in diabetes mortality, but it seemed to have a longer latency than the latency of coronary mortality, associated with coronary mortality. Okay, let's go back to the levels of evidence. And finally, level Roman 3 refers to the opinion of respected experts in the field who are convinced of the value or lack of value of the intervention based, for example, on case series or clinical experience. So how is actual translation done based on these levels of evidence? I think that translation epidemiology, even when based on evidence, is really not an exact science, reminding me of William Farr's remark that that is a fact, all else is inference. Farr, of course, meant that although everyone dies, information is imperfect, and there are traps in its interpretation and application. So let's move along and talk about recommendations for translation of evidence into programs or policies. And again, this is just one of the ways to do it. It's not the only one. Grades A and B in translation express high certainty that the net benefit is substantial, moderate, or moderate to substantial. And so the recommendation would be to design and offer the intervention or program. Grade C is that there is moderate or high certainty that the net benefit is small. The grade justified the recommendation that the intervention should be available to single individuals, conditional upon other considerations. For example, when offering a PSA test, prostate-specific antigen test, making sure that the individual understands its potential benefits and risks. Grade D refers to moderate or high certainty that there is no net benefit or that the harms outweigh the benefits, in which case the intervention should be discouraged. And finally, grade I is that current evidence for decision-making is missing, poor, or inconsistent. And thus, the recommendation would be that if the intervention is offered, individuals should thoroughly understand the uncertainty about the balance of benefits and harms. Now, what I would like to do from now on is to talk about some concepts relevant to the translation of epidemiology. Now, I'm not going to discuss specific strategies that are important to translation, such as comparative effectiveness or translation's multidisciplinary nature. Instead, I would like to briefly discuss some specific epidemiological concepts that are relevant to knowledge translation. And I hope I can persuade you to agree with me that some of the concepts needed for translation counter what most students are being taught these days in the academia. These include whether confounding should always be regarded as a bias, the primacy of the additive model for translation of epidemiological model, reliance on homogeneity of results across studies on effectiveness, and issues related to heterogeneity of findings. So the nature of the first issue that I would like to discuss is somewhat semantic, that is, whether confounding should be always considered a bias, and the implications of equating confounding with bias. Now, in some modern textbooks of epidemiology and biostatistics, bias is classified as due or not due to confounding. The problem that translation epidemiology faces is that policy often has to be based on observational epidemiology, and thus confounding is always an important concern. Now, so we're talking about studies like case control studies, cohort studies. And with regard to the use of, observational domain of epidemiology, epidemiology is, of course, in excellent company. I mean, there are lots of fields that are observational in nature, including astrophysics, geology, and others. The problem is that, notwithstanding recent advances in analytical strategies to handle confounding, such as instrumental variables, Mendelian randomization, propensity score, etc., given the possibility of residual confounding, causal inference from observational data has to be made with caution. So the question is a confounded association useful? Or is it a bias that we must kill off, and the sooner the better? And by useful, I mean useful for selecting and implementing public health action. Now, this slide summarizes schematically what I would call the natural history of a study, which starts with the identification of a study base, the target population, and then proceeds to select the study participants and collect data, which, after being analyzed, are reported as the study findings. So unlike selection bias resulting from bias sampling, with which it is often confused, confounding is found in nature, meaning at the population level. So the question is this different important? And I will tell you that I think it's terribly important for translation epidemiology. I'll give you an example. Let's assume that I'm interested in the relationship between African American ethnicity and hypertension. And let's assume that the relationship is entirely explained by confounding, by risk factors such as the diet rich in salt, obesity, low levels of physical activity, neighborhood-related stress, job strain, and maybe others. Thus, for the purposes of this example, the relation between African American ethnicity and hypertension is assumed to be confounded, not causal. Is it useful to know that, notwithstanding confounding, African Americans have a higher risk of hypertension? I think it is quite obvious that African American ethnicity is a high-risk group, and that this knowledge can be quite useful in screening for hypertension in this ethnic group, and also for promoting cessation or primordial prevention focused on known risk factors. So going back to the question as to whether confounding is always a bias, the answer is the classical epidemiological answer. It depends. It depends on what? Well, yes, if you want to infer a causal relationship. But no, if the purpose is to identify risk markers. So it's therefore important to distinguish between etiological confounding and public health confounding. And incidentally, the latter expression was suggested by me, by Donna Spiegelman from Harvard School of Public Health. And also, I should point out that the usefulness of a confounded association for public health depends on the prevalence of the confounder or confounders in the target population. Excuse me. I don't think I can offer you water. It's not enough for everyone. Thank you. So now I would like to turn to a topic that perhaps more than any other underscores the gap between academic epidemiology and translation epidemiology. And that is the choice of the model we use. Regrettably, even when considering translation of epidemiological knowledge, the estimation of the measure of association or evaluation of interaction is usually a function of the statistical model or scale being used, rather than dictated by the need to use epidemiological knowledge in planning and implementing public health policies and programs. This issue is readily grasped by considering the phenomenon of interaction. So when interaction is qualitative, such as in the case of phenylketonuria, it is obviously present in both the additive and multiplicative scales. On the other hand, caution is needed when assessing the presence of quantitative interaction. And I have a dramatic example here that comes from a secondary prevention study. And the authors stratified the data according to diabetes. and examine the risk of a subsequent infarction for those who already had a previous infarction compared to those who never had a previous infarction. So the incidence for those who already had a previous infarction is the incidence of a recurrent infarction. As you can see in this slide, the relative risk was found to be greater when a history of diabetes was absent than when it was present. That is, there was a negative multiplicative interaction, which is completely counterintuitive. So does this finding mean that if resources were limited and one wished to prevent a recurrent infarction, it would be preferable to focus on those without diabetes? Now, I must say parenthetically that this question is purely theoretical, because recurrent infarction should be prevented regardless of effect modification. But the example serves to illustrate my point. Now, inspection of absolute differences gives us an opposite picture. That is, the absolute difference in incidence was actually greater in those with diabetes than in those without diabetes. So there's a positive additive interaction. So in other words, in assuming a homogeneous distribution of these factors in the population, by preventing a subsequent infarction in those with diabetes, a greater number of cases of recurrent infarction could be prevented. So these findings in this example can, of course, be explained by the fact that the relative risk is in this example is affected by the high baseline incidence of the reference category in those with diabetes. And this is also likely to be true for other modifiers that are potent risk factors. Now, as translation epidemiology is mainly focused on absolute number of cases or deaths that can be prevented, this example highlights the fact that for translation to both public health and also clinical practice, the additive model should be the preferred one, not the multiplicative model. And incidentally, very interesting, some people don't realize that even if you use a multiplicative model like Cox or logistic, you can still evaluate additive interaction in the context of that multiplicative model. And Ken Rothman coined the term public health interaction to express positive additive interaction. Now, let me go back once more to the levels of evidence. So the guidelines in this slide are more detailed than those that I showed you before. And the grading levels shown here go from best to worst. Of course, best is a systematic review of randomized trials, and worst is the opinion of expert that is not evidence-based. Although these guidelines can be used for any outcome, translational epidemiology is particularly concerned with studies of effectiveness. Now, what is interesting is that for each type of study design, randomized trial, cohort studies, case control studies, the highest level of evidence comes from a systematic review with homogeneity. So homogeneity is generally is generally used in support of effectiveness, and heterogeneity as an argument against effectiveness. But these conclusions may be unwarranted. So what I'd like to do is to spend a few minutes talking about problems with homogeneity and heterogeneity. Actually, homogeneity may be the most commonly used of all Hill's criteria to infer causality or effectiveness. Now, starting with homogeneity, its key threat is, as you know, publication bias. I use the term pseudo-homogeneity when consistency of published results across studies is a consequence of publication bias, which, as you know, results from allowing factors other than the quality of the manuscript dictate acceptability for publication. And those factors may include statistical significance or directional findings. So some of the relevant questions pertaining to publication bias are, is publication bias the result of editorial policies? Are authors afraid of rejection of negative results? And in fact, there's some data showing that when the results are not what the investigator expects, he or she does not send the article for publication. They don't publish a report. So rejection experience can be quite traumatic, such as the one experienced by Snoopy. So Snoopy sent a paper to the American Journal of Epidemiology, and I wrote him this following letter. Dear author, thank you for submitting your article to our magazine. To save time, we're including 2 rejection slips, and I feel like doing that often. One for this article, one for the next one you send it. But actually, it has been shown that the main reason why papers based on completed studies are not published is that authors don't submit them. I have found a few relatively old studies, but I couldn't find any recent studies addressing determinants of publication related to authors. And this is a very typical result. You know, studies that are statistically significant have an odds more than 2 times higher of publication, whereas also experimental studies are less likely to be published once the study is done. I mean, I'm talking about studies that have been done, completed, and some time has gone by, which really, otherwise that would, you know, the lack of a publication would mean just the authors did not have the time to write the paper. So typical results can be shown in this slide. And the other determinant, which is also has been shown over and over and over again, is type of sponsorship, private or governmental. And this is just an example of meta-analysis of 321 randomized clinical trials. And the odds of publication of papers endorsing the experimental arm was more than 3 times higher when the sponsor was for profit than when it was not. And the odds ratio for significant results was close to 20. And there have been many systematic reviews showing exactly the same findings, even though the odds ratios vary a little bit from study to study, from systematic review to systematic review. So this is what Bradford Hill said about negative results. They may be dull, but often it is not less important than the positive. And in view of that importance, it must surely be established by adequate publication of the evidence. Now, there are, of course, indirect ways to evaluate the possibility of publication bias, and most systematic reviews contain an evaluation of this type of bias. However, the methods used to evaluate publication bias are not 100% sensitive or specific. And thus, even when we use those approaches, such as the Baggs-Funnell plot, test for symmetry, etc., we cannot be absolutely sure that relevant papers have all been identified. Now, a more complex issue, which actually has more determinants, relates to heterogeneity of results. And of course, one of the main reasons why results are heterogeneous is that the association is not there. So, you know, you see each study departing from the null hypothesis just as a random variability around the null hypothesis. But there are other reasons for heterogeneity, even if the association is present, such as, for example, differences in study design, procedures, and quality. And quality can be markedly variable across studies. This is a systematic review of 83 studies of the relationship of C-reactive protein to coronary heart disease. You can see that only in about 45% of all studies, the authors considered conventional risk factors and inflammatory markers. And in only 1/4 of the study was the outcome validated. Another reason for heterogeneity, which is particularly relevant to translational epidemiology, is differences in effectiveness. And that is due to differences in population characteristics and logistical aspects of studies. For example, population compliance, field exposure, and so on. Now, let me turn to the more subtle determinants that most people do not take into account, and yet they are terribly crucial. And one such determinant is the differences in the phase of the natural history when study is done. Now, you may or may not know that it has been demonstrated that similarly to point epidemics of infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases also show a log normal distribution of cases after the introduction of a risk factor. And 2 well-known examples are bladder tumors in dye-stuff workers and leukemia after the atom bomb explosions. Thus, if a study is done before the minimum incubation period has gone by, cases will be unrelated to the exposure, and its results will be null. Consequently, there could be heterogeneity between studies done before and after the minimum latency. And an example is given by the known relationship, known now we know, between postmenopausal hormonal therapy and breast cancer. And it's in the Human Health Initiative, for instance, no evidence of an increase in breast cancer risk after the introduction of hormone therapy was seen in the first 3 years of the study, perhaps because the minimum latency had not gone by. So another example of the importance of considering the phase of the natural history when examining results from different studies comes from the two NHLBI-funded cohort studies that Dr. Murray has mentioned, the ERIC study and the MESA study. As you know, atherosclerosis has a very long natural history, covering several decades. And there may be differences in the strength of association of individual risk factors with each phase, with different phases of the natural history. So examples of a couple of relevant questions are, is the strength of association of one or more risk factors the same for stable and vulnerable atherosclerotic plaques? Is the strength of the association the same for initiation of atherosclerosis and precipitation of acute clinical events? Focusing on differences in the strength of the association in different phases of the natural history of atherosclerosis, Sherritt and colleagues used data from the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, MESA, to examine the relative importance of smoking in relation to the progress of atherosclerosis. Following the principle that there is no atherosclerotic lesion without a lipid core, these authors developed the concept of low-density lipoprotein equivalent. This is the lipid that is bad for you, right? By asking the question, which concentration of LDL would replicate the effect of smoking, and by extension of any risk factor in each phase of the natural history of atherosclerosis? As a proxy of subclinical atherosclerosis, the authors used B-mode ultrasound to measure the mean intimal medial thickness of the carotid arteries and classified it into minimal atherosclerosis, represented by values below the 75th percentile of the intimal medial thickness without clinical manifestations, moderate, equal or more than 75 percentile, still without clinical manifestation. And they used as an example of severe atherosclerosis was the presence of peripheral lower extremity disease, peripheral artery disease, defined by an ankle brachial index of less than 90. Now, the LDL concentration needed to replicate the smoking associations was shown to increase as the natural history of atherosclerosis progressed, and it was highest for severe atherosclerosis, that is, peripheral arterial disease. For example, to reproduce the effect of smoking in peripheral arterial disease, a concentration of almost 250 milligrams of LDL per deciliter would be needed. And they have replicated the same analysis in the ERIC study and found exactly the same results. Now, of course, this analysis had limitations, such as the fact that the level of smoking was not considered, but they may provide a model that can be used for more refined analysis. Now, the results of these two studies refer to low extremity arterial disease. So one of the important questions, are they also applicable to clinical coronary heart disease, that also denotes severe atherosclerosis? So there is some indirect evidence that this may be the case. In the ERIC study, and unlike what is observed in cancer, the incidence rates of clinical coronary heart disease in former smokers of both genders approach the rate of never smokers, thus suggesting an important effect of smoking in the precipitation of a clinical event. The same pattern was observed in the MESA cohort, where the cumulative incidence of former smokers overlapped that of never smokers. That would not happen in respiratory cancer. So what is the policy implication? Never late to stop smoking, right? Now, there's a further limitation of this analysis. They didn't take into account the time since quitting smoking, even though many participants in both Eric and Meza had quit recently. However, these findings make biological sense given the role of smoking in thrombosis of the coronaries and consequently in the precipitation of an acute coronary event. So what does that have to do with heterogeneity? Well, it has to do with the fact that in populations with a low prevalence of the advanced stages of atherosclerosis, smoking will have a stronger association, whereas in a population where there's not much atherosclerosis around, the relationship between smoking and coronary events is going to be weaker. Excuse me. An additional source of heterogeneity, which does not negate the possibility of a causal association, is differences across studies in the prevalence of an effect modifier. Now, in this example, there's a strong positive additive interaction between asbestos and smoking with regard to lung cancer death rates, in that the association is much stronger, in the absolute difference between the rates is much higher in current smokers than in non-smokers. So let's assume for a second, ignore the small number of deaths in people who never smoked. Let's assume that these data are the gold standard. They are real, valid, and precise. Well, if this is the case, for the sake of this example, in a study carried out in a population where most people are never smokers, the absolute difference will be relatively small, approaching 31 per 100,000. Whereas in another study, in which most people are smokers, the absolute difference would approach 500, 550 per 100,000, denoting a much stronger association. Obviously, this phenomenon is particularly relevant to studies of effectiveness, in which the prevalence of modifiers of the effectiveness of an intervention may explain heterogeneity, significant heterogeneity. Now, finally, I would like to mention that differences between observational studies in variability of either the exposure or the outcome may result in heterogeneity. So a few years ago, Winder and Stallman wrote a paper published in the AJE addressing the issue of variability in case control studies and stated that if cases and controls are drawn from a population in which the range of exposures is narrow, then a study may yield little information about potential health effects. This statement obviously applies also to other types of observational designs, such as cohort studies. A not too hypothetical example is the relationship between fat intake and coronary heart disease in observational studies. Theoretically, in population A, where fat intake does not vary much, amongst individuals in that population, no correlation, or perhaps a weak correlation, will be found at the individual level. Whereas in population B, variability of fat consumption is such that a strong correlation is clearly observed, thus resulting in heterogeneity between those two studies, those two hypothetical studies. And we are all guilty, I'm not all, but most of us are guilty of neglecting the importance of variability, inter-individual variability on study results in our observational studies. And I would say that variability should be systematically considered in observational studies through examination of the distributions of the different variables, or using a measure of variability, the good old coefficient of variability. Parenthetically, although we often equate ecological correlation studies with ecological fallacy, it's almost the first lecture in any epidemiological course of epidemiology. When variability is low in most populations, ecological data may provide the right answer, when within population studies in individuals do not. In this hypothetical example, we have 4 populations in which there is not much variability within each population. But when you look at the ecological correlation, you see a strong linear relationship. This may well be the case of with regard to the relationship between salt and hypertension and blood pressure. Thus, To finalize, neither homogeneity is necessarily evidence of causality or effectiveness, nor heterogeneity is evidence against causality or effectiveness. Consequently, causes of homogeneity and heterogeneity should be better understood before using these concepts in support of or against causality or effectiveness. What I would like to finalize is to propose a comparison between translational epidemiology and what I would call, for want of a better term, academic epidemiology. So let's see. Translational epidemiology focuses on application. Academic epidemiology focuses on etiology mechanisms. They're both important, of course. Translational epidemiology favors measures of association based on absolute differences, attributable risk, effectiveness, and thus its focus is on additive interaction, whereas academic epidemiology favors relative measures of association, such as the relative risk or the odds ratio, and thus it focuses on multiplicative interaction. Public health confounding is useful to identify high-risk groups, so it's useful to translational epidemiology. But in academic epidemiology, it is usually regarded as a bias akin to selection bias. And finally, I would like to quote one of my 5 favorite epidemiologists of all times, George Comstock, who said, if not applied to prevention and public health, epidemiology tends to be fairly boring. Thank you very much.
I'm reminded of June Stevens, who's an epidemiologist at the University of North Carolina, who has often said, if it's not fun, it's not epidemiology. We have time for questions, so be happy. We have 2 mics set up in the aisles. People can step up to the microphones and ask questions. I'll get the process started. You mentioned the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force early in your comments, and it seems to me that this is a group that is engaged very much in what you refer to as translational epidemiology, and taking the work that many of the scientists here at NIH and supported by NIH, who are academics, are developing, and then the task force helps to translate that into useful advice and recommendations for clinical practice. Is that your view of their role?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's the most useful role, and I think every student of epidemiology and every epidemiologist should have a copy of their little book. Well, it's a monograph, right? They publish articles in journals, in peer-reviewed journals.
They issue recommendations quite regularly.
They issue recommendations, but I think they also have a publication with all the current recommendations.
Their annual report.
Yeah.
It looks like we're ready for a question here.
Hi, I'm Janine Figueroa from DCEG, and I was calling. I wanted to ask you about the additive interactions. I think obviously we've identified a slew of genetic variants in various diseases. And I think the next phase, obviously everybody's interested in understanding the combination of genes in the environment. And of course, many of these interactions have been looked at in the multiplicative scale and looking at absolute risk. And so I'm curious if you think it will be informative to actually look at some of these additive interactions in terms of trying to get at translational epidemiology in the future.
So will it be helpful to look at additive interaction in the context of gene-environment interactions?
Well, I'm not a genetic epidemiologist, but I think if you're interested in using the results of genetic studies for primary prevention, yes, absolutely. I think if you find a genotype that modifies the effect of some environmental risk factor, you want to know about that. Now, of course, you have to think not just in terms of what I showed, which was a very simplistic example, but also in terms of what we call the population attributable risk. Because if the genotype strongly modifies the effect of the risk factor, but its prevalence is very small, so it's not going to have a big impact in public health.
Yes, Jermaine.
I'm Moises, Jermaine Buck-Lewis from NICHD. Thank you for that really nice talk. I'm reflecting on the Society of Epidemiologics Research, their past annual meeting with past president Sandro Galea talking about consequential epidemiology. And while I'm a big fan of translational epidemiology, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about whether or not adding too many adjectives in front of the field of epidemiology may be distracting to the public that we're trying to impact.
What's the question?
Do you think adding too many adjectives in front of epidemiology confuses the public?
That's a very good question. Because, you know, the traditional definition of epidemiology already intrinsically has the idea of application. But I think it's useful to use the term translational epidemiology because in the last few years, epidemiologists have favored, I would say, etiology, basically, and mechanisms. And they have gone away. And I think that has a historical cause. I was talking to Sandro Gallia, who is also very interested in this area. And he told me that his explanation, his hypothesis, is that at a given point in time, epidemiology needed to be perceived as a scientific area, in quotes. And public health, as terribly important as it is, does not have a lot of prestige as something like plastic surgery or neurosurgery. Actually, there was a survey a few years ago, and the only medical specialties that did worse in public health were psychiatry and pediatrics. So it's all the way in the bottom. And I really think essentially epidemiology should be that. Okay, you create knowledge, you apply knowledge, programs, prevention, and so on. But unfortunately, we need to highlight the application because epidemiology has really moved away from that a lot. Not entirely. I mean, we have a good example here, Dr. Murray, and you know, your unit as well. But mainly academic epidemiology has strayed a lot from the notion of application.
Yes.
Simeon Zhou from Ethiopia. Actually, I really like the term translational epidemiology. I was going to say thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Actually, my question is how could we, or if we could have a copy of your presentation?
He's asking if you can provide us with a copy of your talk that we could distribute.
Sure, you can do that.
We will arrange that. Other questions? So what advice would you give to students who are currently studying epidemiology and learning the science of epidemiology in an academic institution that could help them keep the need for translation in front of them as they're going forward?
Well, I think the advice should be given to the faculty, not to the students, because the students may be very interested in application, and yet there are no programs in their school that focus on translation of knowledge. It's changing, though. It's changing. Hopkins now has a professional epi track emphasizing application, translation. And I lectured at Harvard a few months ago, and they have an interest group on translation epidemiology. So I think things are changing. And I think both are important, of course. Etiology, mechanisms, and application, they're all important, except that the balance is not right. I think the exclusive focus on etiology mechanisms is too much of a intellectual exercise, as important as it is. So application has to be restored.
Are there other questions from the audience? All right, thank you, Dr. Slow, very much.
Thank you.
We have, let me remind everyone that we have a reception in the library. It's just, you can get there through these double doors. Encourage everyone to come over. We have a little something to snack on, and you can visit with Dr. Sklo and chat with him directly.